The lake was quiet that evening, its surface reflecting the last strokes of gold from a sinking sun. A black man named David had come to this cabin for peace, not only because it sat on the edge of still water, but because it was his sanctuary, an escape from the constant eyes and judgments that too often followed him back in the city. The cabin had been in his family for generations. It wasn't a mansion or a palace, but it carried dignity, history, and the quiet pride of roots that had survived storms of hardship. David wasn't there alone. Across the small wooden table inside the cabin sat an unexpected but significant guest, the state attorney general. Their meeting was private, almost confidential, born from David's quiet but firm involvement in community matters. He wasn't a politician, nor did he seek attention, but his voice carried weight in local struggles, fighting unfair housing practices, calling out racial profiling, advocating for neighbors who were ignored by systems designed to serve all. It was this persistence that had drawn the Attorney General to him. They spoke earnestly that evening about issues larger than themselves. It wasn't about one family, one cabin, or one neighborhood. It was about dignity, equality, and fairness. David poured coffee, and their conversation flowed deep into twilight. And while they spoke unaware, another story was building just outside those wooden walls, a story laced with suspicion, arrogance, and an old prejudice that refused to die quietly. The homeowners' association in that lakeside community had long been a source of tension. The rules were written in neat documents, but their enforcement was often uneven. White families who bent the rules were excused, their violations overlooked as minor. But when black or brown residents did the same, or even less, they faced scrutiny. And David knew this well. From the moment he inherited the cabin, whispers had risen. Who's that man on the property? Does he even belong here? Shouldn't someone check if he has permission? It was as though his ownership, written clear on the deed, mattered less than the color of his skin. The HOA board members had convinced themselves that their authority extended beyond guidelines and landscaping disputes. That evening, emboldened by entitlement and the misplaced belief that they could police someone's existence, they decided to take matters into their own hands. A knock never came. Instead, the front door burst open, wood cracking against the wall as 3 HOA members stormed inside without warning. Their flashlights cut across the cabin, scanning walls, floors, and then landing on David. What's going on here? One of them barked, his voice dripping with accusation rather than inquiry. You can't just be in here without approval. The Attorney General, startled, rose halfway from his chair. His presence was almost surreal to the intruders, an authoritative figure whose face they instantly recognized, though they struggled to process it in the heat of their intrusion. But their eyes quickly darted back to David, as though his very being in that space needed explanation. David's chest tightened, not out of fear, but out of that heavy, weary anger. Black men have carried too many times in America the anger of being presumed guilty before speaking a word. He kept his voice steady, measured, though every syllable carried the weight of centuries. This is my cabin, he said firmly. You've just broken into my home. The intruders looked at each other, fumbling between disbelief and defiance. They tried to disguise their trespass with authority, throwing out claims of neighborhood rules, occupancy checks, and safety concerns. But their excuses crumbled under the sharp silence of the Attorney General, who now stood fully upright, his presence commanding the room. Do you have any idea what you've just done? The Attorney General asked, his tone cold and deliberate. The room seemed to shrink under his words. The HOA members stammered, their earlier bravado fading as realization set in. But David did not let the moment pass quietly. He spoke again, his voice resonant with calm dignity. You didn't knock. You didn't ask. You assumed. You assumed that because I'm a black man sitting in my own home, I must not belong here. That is what you carried with you when you broke through this door. The silence that followed was heavier than the slam of the door had been. Even the crickets outside seemed to hold their song. The Attorney General slowly walked toward the intruders, his eyes locked on them like a judge weighing a verdict. You should know, he continued, that your actions tonight will not go unnoticed, nor unaccounted for. This man has more right to this cabin than you ever had to enter it, and your behavior is not only unlawful, it is discriminatory. The HOA members shifted uneasily, their arrogance now replaced with a desperate awkwardness. But David saw no apology in their eyes, only the panic of being caught in the presence of someone powerful enough to hold them accountable. And yet, power wasn't the true weight in that room. It was dignity. It was David's unshaken composure, the legacy of resilience etched in his every word. For too long, people like the intruders had leaned on power structures to justify their overreach, their suspicion, their quiet racism disguised as concern. But tonight, the balance had shifted. David looked at the Attorney General, then back at the HOA members. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice steady. "I don't owe you my presence explained. I don't owe you proof of belonging. This cabin is my home, and you breaking into it is not oversight. It's an act of violation." The Attorney General nodded, affirming every word. The cabin's walls seemed to pulse with history, generations of families who had endured indignities, and yet kept their dignity intact. Tonight, their story was being written again, but with witnesses who could finally bring the weight of law to match the weight of injustice. Outside, the lake remained calm, reflecting the quiet power of the moment. What had begun as an ordinary evening of conversation had now turned into a lesson written in real time, one about assumption, intrusion, and the undeniable dignity of standing tall in the face of prejudice. But the night was far from over. The HOA members had not yet reckoned with the depth of what they had done, nor the consequences that awaited, and David knew this moment, as painful as it was, could become more than just a personal violation. It could become a turning point, a stand against a system that too often gave such intrusions permission to exist. The Attorney General took out his phone, calmly dialing as the intruders looked on, their faces pale in the dim cabin light. David remained seated, his hands resting firmly on the table, a picture of calm defiance. In his silence was strength, and in his presence was truth. This was not the first time a black man's dignity had been questioned in his own space. But tonight, for once, those who assumed they could enforce their prejudice without consequence would face something different: justice. And as the lake outside carried the last shimmer of moonlight, the story of that cabin began to spread beyond its walls, beyond the whispers of suspicion. It would carry into courtrooms, into headlines, into the hearts of those who understood that dignity is not granted by permission. It is inherent, unshakable, and never up for negotiation. The silence after the Attorney General's phone call was suffocating. The HOA members stood awkwardly near the door, their earlier boldness shattered into fragments of unease. They knew that in one reckless decision, storming into a man's cabin, they had crossed a line that could not be walked back. But what they failed to understand in that moment was that this line had been crossed countless times before in history, always with the same arrogance, always with the same presumption that black lives required validation. Tonight, however, they were being forced to confront not just David, but a system ready to finally hold them accountable. Within half an hour, flashing lights reflected across the lake. Sheriff's deputies arrived, their cars breaking the quiet of the night. The Attorney General met them at the door, his presence alone changing the air. The deputies' posture shifted from routine to reverence the instant they realized who stood before them. "These men," the Attorney General said, pointing to the HOA intruders, "unlawfully entered this cabin, which belongs to Mr. David. Their actions were not only illegal but motivated by racial bias. I want a full report. I will be expecting charges." The deputies hesitated, but not for long. With the Attorney General standing as witness, procedure became unavoidable. The HOA members were asked to step outside, their protest weak and unconvincing. Their excuses sounded smaller and smaller under the weight of law now pressing down on them. David watched silently, his heart heavy but steady. This was not triumph, it was truth being recognized. For years he had lived with quiet intrusions, the long stares, the questions of belonging, the little acts of doubt that chipped away at peace. But tonight the intrusion had a spotlight. Tonight justice could not turn its face away. In the weeks that followed, the story spread. Local news picked it up first. HOA board members arrested after bursting into black homeowner's cabin, then regional papers carried it, highlighting not just the illegality but the symbolism of the Attorney General's presence. Commentaries poured in, some calling it a wake-up call for HOA abuse of power, others framing it as a lesson in racial profiling that communities had ignored for too long. David's quiet life became public in a way he never sought. Neighbors, both supportive and hostile, whispered when he walked down the street. Some praised his courage, others doubled down on their resentment, claiming the HOA had only been doing their job, but David carried himself the same way he had that night, calm, rooted, unwilling to let someone else's prejudice define his place. The Attorney General, true to his word, filed charges against the HOA intruders. Trespassing, unlawful entry, harassment, and violation of civil rights. It wasn't merely about punishment, it was about precedent. Too often such cases dissolved into excuses or settlements that silenced the victim and allowed the perpetrators to walk free, but this case carried weight because it was undeniable. There had been witnesses, law enforcement, and the Attorney General himself. Courtroom proceedings began 2 months later. David sat in the front row, his hands folded, his gaze steady. He did not come to watch his neighbors punished. He came to ensure truth was spoken. When he was called to testify, he stood tall, his voice unwavering. "I was sitting in my own cabin, on property that has been in my family for 3 generations, he told the court. These men did not knock. They did not call. They broke in, assuming I did not belong. They treated me not as a neighbor, but as an intruder in my own home. That assumption, Your Honor, is not born of rule enforcement. It is born of bias." The courtroom was silent. His words carried an undeniable clarity, not dressed in anger, but in truth that pierced deeper than rage ever could. The defense tried to argue that the HOA was acting in the interest of community safety, but their claim fell apart under cross-examination. Records showed no other homeowners had ever faced such treatment. White families who rented their cabins to outsiders were never subjected to midnight intrusions. Rules were enforced selectively and always against people of color. The Attorney General himself testified, a rare move for someone of his office, underscoring the gravity of what had transpired. "I was there that evening," he said. "I witnessed not only unlawful entry, but the underlying assumption that Mr. David's presence required justification. That assumption reflects a broader sickness, a belief that Black ownership is conditional, always in question, always under suspicion. This court must send the message that such conduct has no place in law, no place in community, no place in America." The verdict, when it came, was firm. Guilty on all counts. Fines, community service, and permanent removal from the HOA board. It was not the harshest punishment imaginable, but it was public, undeniable, and symbolic. For David, it was not about watching them fall. It was about watching a system finally acknowledge what so many had ignored. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones pushing forward, cameras flashing. David's words became the closing chapter of the trial. "This was never just about me," he said. "It was about dignity, about the right to sit in your own home without having to prove you belong there, about the right to live free from suspicion because of the color of your skin." Tonight, the court reminded us all that belonging is not granted by an HOA or by the prejudices of neighbors. It is our right, rooted in law, rooted in humanity. The story reverberated beyond the courtroom. Across the country, communities began revisiting the unchecked powers of homeowners associations. Conversations opened about bias hidden under policy, about prejudice cloaked as safety concerns. And though David returned quietly to his cabin, the lake once again his sanctuary, his story lived on as more than a local scandal. It became a lesson in courage, dignity, and justice. On evenings when the sun dipped low across the water, David would sit on his porch with a quiet resolve. The cabin stood as more than a family inheritance now. It was a symbol, a reminder that Black lives, Black ownership, Black dignity could not be stormed, could not be invalidated, could not be erased by arrogance. And though he never sought to become a symbol, David understood that some stories are chosen by the times, and some burdens, though heavy, carry the power to change. His was one of them. The lake remained calm, carrying reflections of history and hope together. For David, for his family, and for every voice still waiting to be heard, the message was clear. Dignity is not negotiable. Justice, though often delayed, is possible. And belonging, true belonging, needs no approval. Months passed after the verdict, yet the ripples of that night at the lake cabin continued to spread outward like circles on still water. What began as a violation of one man's dignity had grown into something larger, something that reached beyond David, beyond the community, beyond even the state. It became a story people told at dinner tables, in classrooms and board meetings where questions of diversity and accountability could no longer be swept aside. David himself had not asked for the spotlight, yet it found him everywhere he went. At the grocery store, strangers approached him with quiet nods of respect. Parents whispered thank yous, saying they wanted their children to know his story, that standing tall in truth mattered. That dignity was worth defending. At church, elders embraced him not as a victim, but as a bearer of history, a man who had carried himself with the same unshaken grace they remembered from the civil rights struggles of decades past. But with recognition also came weight. Not everyone wanted the story to be told. Some in the community grew bitter, muttering about bad publicity, and troublemakers, flyers, appeared on bulletin boards calling David divisive, accusing him of making a mountain out of a molehill. He saw the sideways glances, the averted eyes when he walked past certain neighbors, and yet he understood. Truth has always divided those who cling to comfort from those who demand change. The Attorney General continued his support, not through public appearances but through policy. His office began drafting new state-level measures, restricting HOA powers and requiring anti-discrimination oversight. "We cannot legislate people's hearts," he told David in a private phone call, "but we can make it harder for prejudice to hide behind paperwork." For David, those words mattered, not because laws alone could erase bias, but because every guardrail built into the system gave future generations one less wound to endure. One afternoon, sitting on the cabin porch, David's niece came to visit. She was 12, sharp-eyed, curious, the kind of child who saw the world not as it was, but as it should be. She climbed onto the rocking chair beside him and asked, "Uncle David, why did they break into your house? Didn't they know it was yours?" He paused, the question slicing deeper than any courtroom debate ever had. Looking into her young face, he felt the tug of responsibility, not just to answer, but to plant a seed she could carry with her. "They didn't see me," he said softly. "They saw a story they had already written in their minds, a story where a black man in this cabin couldn't belong. They let that story guide them instead of truth." His niece frowned. "That's not fair." "No," David agreed. "It's not fair. But what matters is how we answer when unfairness shows up at our door. Do we shrink back? Do we get bitter? Or do we stand steady and proud and remind the world who we are?" She nodded slowly, as though writing his words into her own memory. In that moment, David realized something. His battle had never been just for himself. It was for her. For every child who would inherit either a world too afraid to face truth, or one made braver by the voices that refused to be silent. Meanwhile, the HOA itself fractured. Some members resigned, embarrassed by the scandal. Others doubled down, clinging to their authority even as their influence dwindled. A new wave of residents, younger and more diverse, stepped forward to demand transparency. Meetings that once felt like closed doors now opened to wider participation. Rules that once felt like shackles began to bend toward fairness. It was slow, messy, and imperfect, but it was change. And through it all, David kept returning to the lake. The water reminded him of resilience, always shifting, always moving, yet never losing itself. On quiet evenings, he replayed the events in his mind. The door crashing open, the accusations, the Attorney General's voice cutting through. He realized that night had carved something permanent inside him. He had gone into it as a man defending his home, but he had emerged as something more, a witness to truth, a vessel for dignity, a reminder that justice is possible when courage meets timing. Months later, a community forum invited him to speak. He hesitated at first. He was no politician, no preacher, no professional activist, but he knew silence could not serve anyone now. Standing before the crowd, his voice steady, he told the story not with bitterness, but with clarity. "What happened to me," he said, "was not unique. It was visible because of who was in the room that night. But let us not fool ourselves. Similar assumptions are happening every day to people without witnesses, without headlines, without cameras. The lesson here is not about one cabin, one man, or even one HOA. The lesson is about whether we are willing to see one another fully, without the filters of prejudice, without the weight of suspicion." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that holds attention rather than indifference. He looked into their faces, some nodding, some still resistant, but all listening. "I am not asking for sympathy," he continued. "I am asking for vision. To see your neighbor not as a stranger to be policed, but as a human being to be respected. To understand that dignity is not a gift you grant. It is a truth that exists before you ever look my way." When he stepped down, people rose to their feet. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to remind him that change, though slow, was alive. Back at the cabin later that night, David sat once more at the wooden table where it had all begun. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam rising into the dim light, and thought of his ancestors, those who had endured, resisted, survived. He thought of the future, his niece, her generation, and the world they deserved to inherit. And he thought of himself, not as a hero, not as a victim, but as a man who chose to stand when standing mattered. The cabin creaked softly in the night air, its walls holding the weight of the story it had witnessed. Outside, the lake reflected the moon, steady and calm. David knew that life would move forward, challenges would return, prejudice would not vanish overnight. But he also knew this. Dignity, once defended, becomes harder to deny. And so he sat, a quiet man in a quiet cabin, carrying a story that was no longer just his own, a story that would continue to echo wherever truth and justice were needed. A story that whispered, in every ripple on the water, belonging is not granted, it is lived. Seasons changed at the lake. Leaves turned amber and fell across the porch. The water froze, then thawed again into spring. Time moved, but the story of the cabin never faded. Journalists still called, activists still wrote his name, and lawmakers still pointed to his case when drafting bills about housing equality and HOA oversight. For David, it was surreal. He had never asked to be a public figure, never sought to be anyone's symbol. Yet somehow, his life had been pulled into a current bigger than himself. He struggled at times with the weight of it. Strangers wrote him letters, thanking him for his courage. Some shared their own painful stories, families. Harassed by neighborhood associations, people treated as outsiders in their own homes, elders forced to sell under pressure. Their words bled with both anger and hope. And though they were grateful, David felt the ache of their wounds. He would sit at his kitchen table late at night, reading their letters by lamplight, whispering to himself, "This isn't just me. This is us." One afternoon, the Attorney General called again, not as an official, but as a friend. "David," he said, "you've lit a fire you may not realize. Legislators across the state are re-examining HOA powers. Civil rights attorneys are citing your case in briefs. Universities are even teaching it in law classes. I think you should come with me to the Capitol." "Speak for yourself, not just for what happened to you, but for what it means." David hesitated. He wasn't a polished speaker. He wasn't trained for politics. But he knew there are moments when silence is heavier than fear, and so he agreed. When he arrived at the state capitol weeks later, the grandeur of the building struck him, not because of its marble, floors or high ceilings, but because of the long history of voices that had echoed through its halls. Some had pushed for justice, others had fought against it. Now his voice would join that tapestry. Standing at the podium, he looked out over the lawmakers, reporters, and community members. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, but he focused on the words he needed to say. "My name is David," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I am not a politician. I am not a lawyer. I am a homeowner. A man who sat in his cabin one evening, only to have his door burst open because neighbors believed I did not belong in a home I own. They did not ask questions. They did not show respect. They presumed. And in their presumption, they revealed something far greater than a broken door. They revealed how prejudice lives, even in policies that claim to be neutral." He paused, the silence drawing everyone closer to his voice. "I stand here not because of one incident, but because what happened to me has happened to too many others. Without cameras, without witnesses, without accountability. If my story is to mean anything, it must mean that we do not let this happen again, that we demand systems that see people, not suspicion, that we defend dignity, not documents." The chamber erupted into applause, not from all, but from enough. His words carried beyond the Capitol, into headlines, into social media feeds, into living rooms across the nation. Clips of his testimony spread widely, sparking conversations in states far beyond his own. Communities began asking new questions of their HOAs. Who do we serve? Who do we silence? Who do we presume does not belong? David returned to the lake after that day, exhausted but strangely at peace. He knew he had stepped fully into a role he never wanted, but now carried with purpose. The cabin felt different now, still his sanctuary, but also a beacon. Visitors came from time to time, students writing papers, filmmakers documenting civil rights, neighbors seeking advice on their own struggles. David welcomed them with coffee and calm, knowing that his story had become part of theirs. Yet he never let the story consume him. He still sat on the porch at dusk, still listened to the water, still lived his quiet life with humility. What had changed was not his essence, but his reach. He had become a bridge between pain and progress, between silence and truth. Over the years, laws shifted. HOAs across the state were required to undergo anti-discrimination training. Oversight boards were established, ensuring no board could act unchecked. Other states began copying the model, pointing back to the case of one black man at a lakeside cabin as the turning point. David's niece grew older, watching it all unfold. One evening, now a teenager, she sat beside him again on the porch. "Uncle," she said, "everyone at school talks about you. They say you changed the law, that you made history." David chuckled softly. "History is never made by one person. It's made by truth that refuses to be quiet. I just happened to be in the room when truth needed a voice." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Still," she whispered, "I'm proud of you." And in that simple sentence, David felt the circle complete. The battle that began in violation had ended in legacy, not of fame, but of dignity, passed down like a torch to those who would come after. As the sun dipped once more across the lake, painting the water in gold and fire, David whispered a prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for resilience, for justice, for family, for the chance to stand when it mattered most. The cabin stood strong, not just as wood and stone, but as testimony. A reminder that even in a world too often clouded by prejudice, dignity could shine through, steady as light on water. And though David knew more battles lay ahead, not just for him, but for countless others, he also knew this. Courage creates echoes. And once they begin, echoes never die. Years turned into decades. The cabin by the lake aged with grace, its wood darkened by time, its porch worn smooth by countless footsteps. Seasons had cycled endlessly across its windows. Winters of quiet snow, summers of fireflies and laughter, autumns of golden leaves drifting into the water. Through it all, David remained a steady presence, his life unfolding like the ripples on the lake, expanding outward, reaching far beyond what he could see. He had grown older, his hair now silver, his hands marked with the lines of work and time. Yet his posture carried the same dignity as the night. The HOA stormed through his door. People still remembered that story, though for many it had become more legend than headline. University students still wrote about him. Activists still referenced him. Lawmakers still pointed back to the reforms his courage inspired. But for David, the story was never about fame. It was about the simple truth he had always known, that no one should have to prove they belong in their own home. The cabin remained his sanctuary, but it was no longer only his. His niece, now grown into a strong young woman, often brought her own children to visit. They filled the porch with laughter, running barefoot down the dock, tossing pebbles into the water just as he had done when he was a boy. David would sit in his chair, watching them with a quiet smile, knowing that the cabin was no longer just a place of memory, it was a place of inheritance. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and violet, his niece sat beside him once again. She had grown into the kind of woman who carried herself with the same quiet strength he had always admired. She worked as a civil rights attorney now, traveling across the state, defending those who faced the same injustices he once endured. "Uncle," she said softly, "do you ever regret it? That night? All the attention it brought?" David looked out across the water, his reflection shimmering faintly on its surface. He thought of the intrusion, the court battles, the speeches, the endless retelling of a story he never asked to live. He thought of the weight of being seen not just as a man, but as a symbol. Then he shook his head gently. "No," he said. "I don't regret it, because it wasn't just about me. It was about you. About your children. About everyone who needed to know that dignity cannot be broken, even when a door is." She placed her hand on his, her eyes shining. "You taught me that, Uncle. You showed me what it means to stand tall when the world tries to make you small. That's why I do what I do." His heart swelled with pride. He had not set out to teach lessons. He had only tried to live honestly. But perhaps that was the lesson. The dignity lived out in truth teaches louder than any speech ever could. Later that night, when the house was quiet and the children had fallen asleep, David walked slowly down to the water's edge. The lake reflected the moon, still and calm, just as it had all those years ago. He leaned against the wooden railing of the dock, breathing in the cool night air. Memories rose around him, his family before him, his ancestors whose resilience had carried him to this place, the long line of voices that refused to be silenced. He thought of the Attorney General, now long retired, who had stood by his side. He thought of the courtroom where truth had been spoken. He thought of his niece's young face the first time she asked why the intruders had broken in, and then he thought of the children upstairs sleeping peacefully, unaware of how much history had been carried to give them this freedom. David whispered a prayer into the night, a prayer of gratitude, of hope, of strength for the generations to come. May they never have to fight this fight again, he said quietly. But if they do, may they fight it with dignity. The wind stirred across the lake, carrying his words like an echo into the darkness. He felt at peace. Years later, when David's time finally came, the cabin passed fully to his niece. On the day they laid him to rest, the community gathered, neighbors, officials, old friends, even strangers who had only known him through the story of that fateful night. They spoke not only of the injustice he had endured, but of the dignity with which he carried it. They spoke of the reforms his courage sparked, of the voices he amplified, of the legacy he left. And when his niece stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, she echoed the very words he had once spoken in the courtroom. My uncle's story was never just about him. It was about dignity, about belonging, about the truth that no one should have to explain why they exist in their own home. He taught us that dignity is not a gift to be granted, it is a truth to be lived. The crowd rose to their feet, not in mourning, but in honor. Back at the lake, the cabin stood tall, its windows glowing softly in the evening light. His niece's children played on the porch, their laughter carrying across the water. And though David was gone, his presence lingered in every board of the cabin, in every ripple of the lake, in every lesson passed down through generations. The story of the man whose dignity could not be broken had become more than memory. It had become legacy. A legacy that lived in laws, in families, in the quiet courage of everyday people who refused to let prejudice define them. And so the lake remained, timeless and still, carrying the reflection of a man who stood firm, who spoke truth, who reminded the world that dignity is eternal. For in the end, David's life had been more than resistance. It had been a reminder that even when doors are broken, dignity remains unshaken. A reminder that belonging is not granted by permission, but by existence itself. A reminder that courage, once lived, becomes an inheritance that no one can erase. And as long as the cabin stood by the water, his story would stand too, echoing across time, carrying forward into every life it touched, whispering the same unshakable truth. Dignity is forever. Years after David was laid to rest, his name still stirred conversations in halls of power, classrooms and living rooms alike. What had begun as a humiliating intrusion in his own cabin had rippled outward into something far larger than one man's story. His niece, now the steward of both the cabin and his legacy, had become one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the region. Her victories in court were often attributed not just to her sharp mind, but to the conviction she carried. The conviction born from watching her uncle refuse to bow when others tried to strip him of his humanity. At conferences and universities, she was often asked to tell the story. She would stand before young audiences, students, organizers, aspiring lawyers, and recount the night when HOA representatives trespassed into her uncle's home. She spoke of their arrogance, their entitlement, their disbelief that a black man could rightfully own what they coveted. And then she told of the courtroom, where David's calm voice had shattered their assumptions more powerfully than anger ever could. Every time she finished, the room fell into a reverent silence. Because it wasn't just history. It was a mirror. It forced people to ask themselves, if dignity were challenged in front of me, what would I do? But the story didn't stop in lecture halls. David's name found its way into law. A landmark state housing reform bill was passed, aimed at preventing abuse of power by homeowners associations and local boards. It was called the Harding Act, after David Harding, the man who had turned his cabin into a symbol of unshakable dignity. The law ensured that no homeowner could be harassed, fined, or falsely penalized based on race, income, or status. It created oversight boards, accountability measures, and civil protections. But more than that, it carried David's spirit into the legal framework of the state itself. One afternoon, years after its passing, his niece stood on the steps of the state capitol, invited to speak at the anniversary of the Harding Act. She gazed out over a crowd, filled with young activists, lawmakers, and families who had benefited from the protections the law offered. My uncle never wanted to be famous, she began, her voice steady. He wanted to be left in peace. He wanted to sit in his cabin, watch the lake, and live his life with dignity. But when that dignity was challenged, he refused to shrink. He refused to let others define his worth. Today we stand not just in memory of what he endured, but in recognition of what he built. His resistance gave us this law, these protections, this hope. But more than laws, he left us a lesson, that our dignity is ours, and no one can take it unless we surrender it. The applause that followed was thunderous, but she did not bask in it. She knew the work wasn't finished. Discrimination still existed in new forms, subtle but dangerous. Her uncle's story wasn't an end, it was a beginning. Back at the cabin, the legacy lived even quieter lives. Families would sometimes drive out just to see the house, to sit on the dock, to feel what they had read in articles or seen in documentaries. His niece allowed them, so long as they respected the home. She would smile when they asked if they could take pictures. Sometimes she would invite them inside, show them the chair where David used to sit, the table where he wrote letters, the very lock that had once trapped a trespasser's car. The children she had once brought to visit grew into adults themselves. One became a filmmaker and decided to make a documentary about David's life. The film, titled Unshaken, premiered at national festivals, earning awards and sparking new conversations. Audiences wept as they watched dramatizations of the night the HOA stormed his home, and they rose to their feet as the film ended with David's words. "Dignity is not something I ask for. It is something I carry, and I will not set it down." Generations that had never met him now spoke his name. Yet for his niece, the most powerful moments weren't in courts, capitals, or theaters. They were in the quiet evenings when she sat on the same porch where he had once sat. She would sip tea, listening to the lake breathe in and out, and feel her uncle's presence in the stillness. Sometimes she would whisper to him, telling him about her victories, her struggles, her fears, and in those moments she always felt him near. One autumn, when the leaves burned gold and red, she hosted a gathering at the cabin, not of lawmakers or reporters, but of family. Her children, her grandchildren, cousins and nieces all crowded into the wooden living room, telling stories about David. They laughed at his quirks, marveled at his courage, and reflected on the life he had lived. At the end of the evening, her youngest grandson asked innocently, "Grandma, why was Uncle David so famous?" She smiled, kneeling down to meet his eyes. He wasn't famous because of what he owned. He wasn't famous because of money or power. He was remembered because he never let anyone take away his dignity, and when people saw that, they were reminded of their own dignity too. The boy nodded as if storing it away for later. And so the story continued, not as a headline, not as a court case, not even as a law, but as a living inheritance passed from one heart to another. David's story, once rooted in pain and confrontation, had blossomed into something unbreakable. A reminder that no matter how the world shifts, the human spirit, when rooted in dignity, cannot be uprooted. And long after names of officials faded, long after the HOA dissolved into irrelevance, long after even the Harding Act was folded into new reforms, one thing remained timeless: the lake, the cabin. The story of a man who refused to bow. Decades had passed since David's time on Earth. The world had changed, laws had shifted, and generations, who never knew his face, now spoke, his name as if he were an ancestor of everyone who had ever fought for dignity. The cabin by the lake still stood, weathered but sturdy, a living testament to the man who once called it home. His niece had long since joined him in rest, but her children and grandchildren kept the cabin alive, not as a tourist attraction, but as a sanctuary. They refused to sell it, no matter the offers, no matter the pressure. "This cabin is our heartbeat," they would say. "It is not for sale because dignity is not for sale." Each summer, the family gathered there, much like they had when David was alive. They came not just to enjoy the water, but to remember. On warm nights, they lit lanterns on the dock, letting them float across the lake as symbols of memory and hope. Each lantern carried a whispered prayer, for strength, for justice, for the courage to stand unshaken. Children grew up hearing the story not as history, but as legend. Around the fire pit, elders would tell it with the cadence of folklore. There was once a man named David Harding who lived by this lake. And one night, when others thought he didn't belong, they burst through his door. But David did not tremble. He stood with the weight of justice beside him, and from his stillness the world changed. The children would listen wide-eyed as though hearing of a hero who fought dragons, and in their hearts they believed they could be just as brave when their moment came. As the decades turned into a century, scholars began to revisit David's story as part of a broader narrative of Black dignity in America. Universities included his case in their curricula. Students debated it in law schools, dramatized it in theater classes, and analyzed it in history seminars. They saw how one small incident, an HOA, breaking into a cabin, could ripple into reforms that outlasted lifetimes. A museum dedicated to civil rights eventually opened an exhibit called The Cabin by the Lake. Inside, a replica of David's living room was reconstructed. Visitors could sit in a chair modeled after his, listen to recordings of his courtroom testimony, and read letters written by his supporters. School buses lined the street outside as teachers brought children to learn about a man who had once simply wanted peace, but ended up shaping the definition of justice. And so, long after his body had returned to the earth, his spirit flowed through time like the waters of the lake, endless, patient, eternal. David Harding had become more than a man. He had become a legend. Centuries had passed. The world no longer resembled the one David Harding had known. Cities stretched higher than mountains. Ships sailed between planets, and technology had woven itself into every corner of life. Yet for all its progress, humanity still carried with it the timeless questions. Who belongs? Who is worthy? Who holds dignity in the face of power? And so, even in this new age, the story of the cabin by the lake was still told. Not as history, few remembered dates or laws, but as a parable. The tale of a man who lived quietly, who only wanted peace, but who became a mirror to a society still learning what it meant to honor the human soul. Children in distant classrooms, light years away from the lake, still heard the legend. There was once a man named David Harding. He lived by the water, where the trees whispered and the sunsets burned gold. But one night, those who thought themselves in charge broke into his home. They believed he did not belong. But David stood firm, and though his voice was soft, it carried through centuries. He reminded the world that dignity cannot be trespassed. It belongs to us as surely as breath. The children would whisper the name Harding like they once whispered names from Scripture. His cabin had become less a place and more a symbol, a reminder that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to move. Back on Earth, the cabin itself had endured. Preserved as a global heritage site, it stood on the edge of the lake like a sentinel of memory. The family no longer owned it. It now belonged to everyone. Pilgrims came from around the world, stepping across the wooden porch as if crossing into sacred ground. Some knelt, some wept, some simply sat and breathed the same air, as though hoping to catch a fragment of David's unshakable spirit. Inside, the home remained untouched, his chair by the window, his worn books on the shelf, the table where he had once read letters and written thoughts. But beyond the artifacts, it was the silence that moved people most. The silence of a man who, even under assault, had never raised his voice to anger, but instead let truth speak for him. On the 300th anniversary of the Harding Act, the world gathered in a way that would have astonished David. Not just nations, but entire colonies across the solar system paused for remembrance. A ceremony was broadcast simultaneously from Earth, Mars, and orbital stations. Leaders, scholars, and children alike shared words about the man, who had taught them all what justice meant. But no speech could capture the essence better than the simple inscription etched into a monument beside the cabin. Here lived a man who would not bow. Here stood dignity unbroken. In the twilight of that commemoration, when the crowds dispersed and the cameras shut off, a young girl remained by the monument. She was not a Harding by blood, not tied by family, but she felt bound to him nonetheless. Her parents had told her the story since she was small. To her, David was not history. He was a guardian. She looked out over the lake, where the water shimmered in fading light, and whispered to herself, "If ever they come for me, I will stand like David." In that whisper, the story lived on, not in monuments, not in laws, not even in books, but in the quiet courage of ordinary hearts. For that was the true measure of his legacy, not that he had been remembered, but that he had made countless others believe they too could endure. And so the cabin remained, century after century, not simply as wood and stone, but as eternal witness. The lake reflected skies that changed with time, but its waters still carried echoes of the man who had once sat on its shore, watching the sun fall with a calm no one could shatter. David Harding was gone, yet he was everywhere. In the silence of protest, in the steadiness of those who refused to yield, in every heart that whispered, "Dignity is mine, and I will not set it down." In the end, the story was not about a man or a cabin or even an act of law. It was about the eternal truth that lived through them all. Dignity is the soul's most unshakable claim. And so, though centuries passed, the world kept telling the story of the cabin by the lake until it was no longer just history. It was heritage. It was legend. It was eternity. The cabin stood. The water whispered. The story never ended. In the twilight of that commemoration, when the crowds dispersed and the cameras shut off, a young girl remained by the monument. She was not a Harding by blood, not tied by family, but she felt bound to him nonetheless. Her parents had told her the story since she was small. To her, David was not history. He was a guardian. She looked out over the lake, where the water shimmered in fading light, and whispered to herself, "If ever they come for me, I will stand like David." In that whisper, the story lived on, not in monuments, not in laws, not even in books, but in the quiet courage of ordinary hearts. For that was the true measure of his legacy, not that he had been remembered, but that he had made countless others believe they too could endure. And so the cabin remained, century after century, not simply as wood and stone, but as eternal witness. The lake reflected skies that changed with time, but its waters still carried echoes of the man who had once sat on its shore, watching the sun fall with a calm no one could shatter. David Harding was gone, yet he was everywhere. In the silence of protest, in the steadiness of those who refused to yield, in every heart that whispered, "Dignity is mine, and I will not set it down." In the end, the story was not about a man or a cabin or even an act of law. It was about the eternal truth that lived through them all. Dignity is the soul's most unshakable claim. And so, though centuries passed, the world kept telling the story of the cabin by the lake until it was no longer just history. It was heritage. It was legend. It was eternity. The cabin stood. The water whispered. The story never ended.